Some of you apparently yesterday thought I looked evil wearing this jacket. Really, I'm wearing it because it's very cozy and it's warm. But today, we're going to talk about some interesting statistics. Now, I've done my stats videos before. We're not going to do them as we normally do them today. We're just going to take a look at some individual kind of interesting things using the data, not just from this year, but also from 2024 as well. So this data is taken from all of the tier 1 games from 2024 and 2025. And we're going to just talk about one or two things on each map. We're going to start off with Abyss, where we're actually first going to talk about Yoru. And you might have thought, if you're like me, that Yoru would be really good on Abyss, right? Like, it's a big map, you could TP across it. But if you actually take a look at the numbers, you can see that in 2024, we didn't get a ton of games on Abyss in 2024. But, you know, he was being picked some of the time. And then in 2025, you know, he saw also, you know, a fairly high pick rate overall at 36% there, right? So, a decent pick rate overall. But if you take a look at his win rate this year, it's actually not that great, right? You might think that this would be a much higher number for an agent like Yoru, that on a lot of the other maps, if you're wondering, you know, Yoru does do very well, right? Like, he is a very strong agent, you know, but Abyss seems to be one of the maps where Yoru actually didn't do as well on this show, which again might be a bit counterintuitive to what you think about, like, you know, Abyss is like a big open map where Yoru can, you know, explore and get aggressive on the defense side and, you know, help out on the attack side as well, you know, potentially in some kind of double duelist thing or whatever. But it just didn't work nearly as well on Abyss as it did on other maps. Now, tomorrow I'm actually going to do a video talking about the archetypal data, and well, this is a bit of a theme on Abyss as well, is that double duelist on Abyss didn't nearly do as well as it did on some of the other maps. So maybe that is one of the reasons that Yoru perhaps struggled a bit more than you might have expected. Now let's move on to Ascent, where we have a similar sort of thing going on, where it's an agent that you probably think is pretty good on Ascent and has a decent pick rate on Ascent, but actually the numbers tell a bit of a different story. So it's actually Cypher here on Ascent that, again, if you take a look at the pick rates, actually a pretty big increase from 2024 to 2025 overall, but you know, a pretty healthy pick rate in general. But if you take a look at the win rates here, I mean, 2024 was a disaster, and 2025, whilst it was better, still not great, right? Still not good, which I found, again, very interesting. Cypher, I think most people think, is kind of the default pick, perhaps, at this point on Ascent. Obviously, with the nerfs, we'll see how that goes forward. But, you know, certainly he was, before the nerfs, you know, kind of a default pick on this map. And, again, I find that quite interesting. Now, again, similar to Yoru, I think some of this is archetype data type stuff, right? That, you know, some of those double senti comps, like, for instance, the double senti comp that Cypher played in, the Deadlock Cypher, wasn't very good and wasn't a good idea. But we had other double senti comps, you know, like the Chamber Vice stuff or the Sage Vice stuff that we saw later on in the year, you know, that did have, you know, fairly decent win rates throughout the year. So that will be part of it, of Cypher's, you know, win rates not being the best. But that's not all of it, right? Other parts of it are just in normal comps. You know, the Cypher version wasn't the best version, which maybe tells you that on a map like Ascent, less information, but having more hard stall for any fast execs that come your way, right? Maybe are just a bit of a better way of playing the map. You do get some, you know, kill trips here, getting some kills here and there, but maybe that's not like the primary way, you know, that Cypher is finding value on his side holds necessarily. So maybe just having, you know, a Vice this past year, or maybe going to the future, maybe Killjoy again, and just having more of that kind of like hard stall, you're not coming in, is going to be a bit better overall for this map. Okay, next up is an agent that I think, especially after the most recent patch, most people aren't too high up on, but we're talking about Bind, and we're talking about Gecko, because Gecko's pick rates on Bind, I mean, it has come down in 2025, but it still was 34%. That's still quite a lot, right? And in 2024, it was enormous, his pick rate on Bind, but you see the win rates, as you might expect, not that great. And I'm sure if we, you know, played out 100 games right now on the current patch of Gecko, it probably would be even lower, right? So this, again, isn't like taking you anywhere crazy with this in terms of Gecko, but I do think that I just kind of wanted to highlight that, you know, Bind is probably a map that you think about as like Gecko's best map overall. And even if that is the case, you see that the numbers still aren't great. Obviously, we can understand that, and hopefully Riot, you know, has these numbers and understands that certainly at this point, we're going to need probably some pretty significant Gecko buffs hopefully coming in the future. Okay, moving on to Corrode, and obviously Corrode doesn't have any 2024 data, but again, there's an interesting agent here that hasn't got picked a ton so far on Corrode, but interesting, the best teams perhaps at Corrode, certainly that we saw at Champs, are picking this agent, and it's KO. And KO's win rate on Corrode, again, it's not a massive sample size, right? It's only 17 games in terms of his non-mirror games, but he's won 13 out of 17. Now, again, you've got teams like MIBR and NRG, who I think, showed a very high level of Corrode when it came to Champs. They're playing the KO, and I do think that their direction, even if you don't think their exact comp is the comp that you want to play, I think their direction where they go with no Sentinel, double Initiator, double Smokes, certainly was the best way of playing the map, but with the Sentinel nerfs as well, I actually think it probably will continue even with, the Initiator nerfs and all of that. And so KO, again, KO got a buff, of course, as well with the underhand flash getting a bit better. I think is going to just be a very solid pick, and statistically wise, looks like a very solid pick on this map going forward. Okay, moving on to Haven, and we got a couple for Haven. The first one is one that, I've been saying for a very long time. And it seems like people kind of caught up, of course, with Gen G this year, and then a lot of other people, which is Viper on Haven. Viper on Haven is just good. You see that the pick rate in 2024, Viper on Haven basically disappeared, right? There was only 9 games of Viper, all of last year on Haven. This year, it did increase, and towards the end of the year, it increased quite a lot. Because, again, earlier on in the year, there was basically no Viper on Haven. But there should be, because playing Viper on Haven is good. And I said this on Plat Chat as well, and I do thoroughly believe this, by the way, that if you took away the Snakebite and the Viper Spit, and Viper only had 2 abilities on maps like Haven and Lotus, I still think Viper would have a non-mirror win rate of about 50%. Even if you took away 2 abilities from Viper. That's how strong the Wall and the Orb are on, maps like these. And so, yeah, just until they nerf Viper, and obviously in the meta that we're currently, going into, where Viper is looking even stronger versus the competition, I cannot imagine for a second that if anyone is thinking of playing Breach and those old Breach comps over a Viper comp, at this point in the game, you have lost your damn mind. But speaking of the old meta on Haven, one agent that, again, historically hasn't been that good on Haven, even though you might have thought that this wouldn't be the case, but it is Jett. Because if you take a look at Jett's win rates, I mean, the 2024 pick rate, just think about this, right? The 2024 pick rate, Jett had over 50% of the picks on Haven. And the non-mirror win rate was less than 30%. Think about that. Now, this year, we kind of course-corrected a bit, right? The pick rate went down a lot in a lot of those, familiar Breach comps. You were seeing Neon instead. And then, obviously, we saw kind of more Viper. We saw some, Yoru ISO, Fnatic stuff. We saw a general move away from, the old meta on Haven, which is a good idea. But even so, sometimes when the pick rate comes down, it's a bit more of a surprise pick. The win rate goes up. Well, it did go up a bit, but still awful. Just don't play her on Haven, even though you might have thought that that was one of the best maps for Jett. No. Okay, moving on to Icebox. And unlike Haven, where the old meta isn't very good, that is not true on Icebox. The 2021 meta on Icebox is still alive and well. It's still doing perfectly great, because picks like Sage can still do pretty well. You see that the pick rate is actually pretty consistent between 2024 and 2025. But the win rates in both years as well, were just pretty good. Right, and I think, again, we started to see this towards the end of Icebox being in the map pool, that more and more people were just picking Sage. And, just kind of going back to very basic comps from 2021 and 2022, and finding some success with it, right? And basically just saying, yep, this was the best way of playing the map back in the day, and it still is. Sage, still allows you to get that spike down, and that's basically all that matters. Now moving on to Lotus, and in Lotus this year we saw a massive rise for one agent in particular who did pretty well, which was Yoru. Yoru, as you can see here in 2024, was basically never picked, only picked 7 times out of 408 chances to be picked. But obviously this year we've seen a meteoric rise for Yoru, perhaps in general, right? And you see that reflected somewhat in the pick rate. But I think going forward, I would expect we will still see a fair amount of Yoru still, because the win rate was very good, right? This is 115 non-mirror games. That is a lot in 1 year to have, this is a fairly big sample size of Yoru on this map. And, You know, there are other things, you know, a lot of these losses, by the way, will be to like the Fnatic meta kind of comp, right? Which is still a very competitive comp and still is pretty good overall. So yeah, those were the comps that like Yoru was losing to, but Yoru in and of himself is just a good pick on this map. And yeah, if Yoru is just good, who would have thought? Okay, moving on to Pearl, and Pearl actually wasn't in the map pool at any point during 2024, so there is no data for it in that year, but there is for the start of this year. Of course, it was in, and the agent that I think kind of, you know, impressed the most, perhaps, over expectation was Chamber. And we actually saw Chamber played in a variety of comps, you know, some double Senti comps, some solo Chamber stuff, and it found success, you know, across the board, to be honest. Again, these aren't massive sample sizes because, you know, this map wasn't in the map pool, you know, for the entire year or anything, but, you know, Chamber looked like a good option, which obviously now going forward, it would be interesting to me to see, you know, if an agent like Vito as well, right? I could see being quite a good option on a map like Pearl in that new map pool also. So quite interested to see what we get on Pearl, and I think whether it's Chamber or whether it's Vito, I think there's definitely probably going to be some space for an agent like that on this map. Okay, now moving on to Split, and this one's going to be a little bit different here. We're actually going to take a look at two agents against each other, because this one is kind of weird, where we've got Astra and Omen on Split and their data here. Astra's numbers here on the left, Omen's here on the right, and Omen, obviously, his pick rate is much higher than Astra's overall, although we did see a bit of a swing back to Astra this year versus last year. But take a look at the win rates, because in 2024, we were heavily on Omen. But in 2025, that's actually flipped completely around the other way. So I'm not really sure what's going on here, right? Maybe this is just, you know, part of like a random sampling thing. And in actual fact, you know, they're both fine on Split, right? They're both like 50-50 options. And it's just, you know, we got kind of two more extreme results perhaps in smaller sample sizes. But I will certainly be interested in this going forward to see like who actually is the better choice on Split. Obviously, I think most people would say Omen is generally a better agent, so probably just pick Omen if you're unsure. But I'll certainly be interested to look at this, you know, going forward, because certainly this year, picking Astra actually found more success. And then finally, we'll come to Sunset, and, well, you know it's me, and you know it's one of these stats videos, so you know I have to bring up Breach at some point. But there was a kind of talk about Breach, like, oh, Sunset is the one map you can play Breach, you know, that's the one map that he actually has a positive win rate on. In fact, actually, quick quiz question, there is one map where Breach has an above 50% non-mirror win rate this year. There is only one map. Let me know what you think it is in the comments down below. But on Sunset, it's not Sunset, because he actually ended up one game under 50% by the end of Champs. So even that isn't going his way. But again, I just wanted to show kind of the 2024 numbers as well, where Sunset was in the map pool basically, you know, the entire year. So we got a bit of a bigger sample where Breach also struggled. Breach obviously as well got nerfed recently. Right now, if you're a Game Changers team, right, or something, you know, looking at the new patch and thinking about what you're going to play on Sunset, I would heavily advise don't play Breach, right? Like, play double controller, play double duelist, you know, whatever, whichever suits your style better, play one of them. Probably don't bother with Breach. And so those were some little stats for you. You know, hope you enjoy it. As I say, in the upcoming days, my next video will be about kind of archetypal data and taking a look at, like, you know, on specific maps, like, you know, oh, double duelist beats double initiator here, you know, all that kind of stuff is what we'll be diving into. So yeah, stay tuned for that.